This is the Valley Labor Report for Sunday, April 26, 2020. My name is Jacob Morrison. I'm here with David Story, and we're going to go ahead and start the show. First off, I've got a little bit of housekeeping, some show administration that I wanted to let y'all in on. As you know, the whole reason for this show is so that we're going to be on talk radio in North Alabama. We're going to be on 92.5 WVNN in the Huntsville, Decatur, Athens listening area, and that's like the whole reason that we're doing this. And so I've been in talks with the station manager, and I just wanted to keep y'all updated. I know that we were originally going to be on the air first weekend in April, and that had to be pushed back because of the coronavirus. So I've been talking to the station manager some more, and they said that they're going to be having a meeting with their corporate folks on Monday about whether or not they want to start this show, which would be, the newest show on the station, whether they want to start it the first weekend or the second weekend in May. So we're looking to start in May. The question is really just going to be the first or second weekend. But we do believe that we're going to be able to get in there in May, and it's just going to be, whether it's the first or second weekend. They've got some good stuff set up that will help us socially distance when we're in there. So, I'm hoping for sooner rather than later, but, we'll see. And I will be recording a small update that I'll post myself after I hear from the station manager. So you can be expecting that midweek, and that should have a hard date on when we're going to be on the air, which we're really, really excited about. I'm looking forward to it. This is the largest news talk station in North Alabama. None of the others are really relevant. And so it's a big audience, and it's an audience of conservative folks. This is where Sean Hannity started. This is Rush Limbaugh plays on this station. Ben Shapiro plays on this station. So, this is a group of folks that have never heard anything good about unions. They've never heard anything good about solidarity or collective action. And so the field is fertile, right? There's a lot of it's a good mission field, so to speak. So we're looking forward to having that opportunity to talk to some folks that have never heard any of the things that we're going to be saying. So just wanted to give y'all an update on that.
It'll be interesting to get some calls on those folks too.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got to believe that we're going to change some hearts, change some minds, because, it's conservative or not, unionism isn't, a political message per se. So
exactly.
I think it'll be wonderful.
I think so too. I think it'll be worth it, the work that we're putting in. So moving into the headlines, a lot of folks are really missing Panoply this year. This is the weekend that we were supposed to have it. It was supposed to be, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and I'm missing it too. We always go. It's a big deal here in Huntsville. All the local artists come out, show their work. A lot of the school kids have tents at Panoply to show off their work. And it's just a really good time for the community, and we're not able to do it this year because of the coronavirus. But the Panoply Facebook page is showcasing artists, like we said a few weeks ago. So if you're really missing out on that, you're really wishing that you could see some good local art, check out their Facebook page, go scroll through their feed, look at some of the photos, some of the stuff. They're showcasing music as well. And all of these artists, a lot of them have tip jars, a lot of them have Patreon pages. Panoply has an artists fund that they use kind of like a grant. So, if you've got some extra money, you got some extra time, go through the Facebook page, look at those photos. It'll brighten your day. There's some really good stuff there. So,
buy a shirt.
Yeah. They've got.
Did you see the design that they came out with this year?
Yeah,
it was
really
awesome,
nice. Like
really awesome. And and they said all the proceeds were going to support their grant for the independent artists. So, go buy a shirt. Spend some money if you're working.
Yep. Or if you're getting if you been laid off and you've got the unemployment stuff coming in safely. You know, if you get a little bit of money, try to support them if you can. So Alabama has currently passed 6,000 coronavirus cases with more than 200 deaths, not 2,000, 200 deaths. And in the United States, we have passed 939,000 cases, going on 1 million, and we've passed 53,000 deaths. So we're really getting up there, and you know, this not great. On the topic of the coronavirus, though, we've been seeing a lot of reopen such and such protests lately. Reopen Michigan, reopen Idaho, whatever. And a lot of the larger ones have been astroturfed. Astroturfing is where a big money funder funds protests, funds people to go out and make it look like this is some kind of grassroots thing that has real support among the people. And a lot of this has been pretty clear astroturfing. In Michigan, for example, which was one of the larger protests, there were pretty clear links to organizations funded by the DeVos family. Betsy DeVos is a Secretary of Education in the Trump administration, and her family has huge, their tentacles are just all over Michigan politics. It's really terrible what they've done to the education system in that state. They are huge charter advocates, really just destroying public education. Any good public service that the government does, the DeVos family is trying to destroy it and privatize it and stuff. So there's a lot of really clear astroturfing going on. It's just not real. And we can also see that in the states that are not electorally important for Republicans, like Alabama, where they've got a stranglehold on the political scene. The protests have just been pathetic. Like in Huntsville last weekend, there was a Reopen Alabama protest that had 10 people there. You know, but funnily enough, the protest was so small that they weren't even technically violating the social distancing guidelines while they were protesting social distancing. So, you know, like you can see clearly there's political motivation to do these AstroTurf campaigns in swing states like Michigan or like Idaho, places like that could be potentially electorally important. But Alabama, they've got this state on lock, so they don't need to, you know, they don't need to invest a lot of money in making it look like people are upset here, so they don't. And you can see what the results are. The results are people don't largely want to reopen completely. They want to make sure that everything is done orderly, everything is done safely, and that they're safe and their family is safe and their community is safe.
Yeah, and if you look at the last, I was looking this morning, if you look at the trending since Kay Ivey finally announced, you know, the shelter in place, it's really started trending down. And you can see that it made a tremendous amount of difference because we were on an upward trajectory, and now we've actually, new cases are dropping. So that's a great thing. Right.
Yeah. It's, you know, the guidelines are working. People are following them by and large. And so we're seeing a decrease in new cases and new deaths. And so that's good. But one of the problems that the protesters are identifying that I think that it's important to actually take a little bit of time to think about is this idea that these social distancing, these stay-at-home orders, that they're creating a police state. And it's really easy to dismiss these complaints because anybody that is really concerned about authoritarianism and police brutality knows that we have been living under a police state for basically the entirety of the existence of the United States. It just doesn't largely affect white folks or well-off white folks. And now that it does, they're upset. And so it's really easy to dismiss those concerns as like, you didn't care before, but you care now because you can't get your hair cut. You know, screw you, like, stay at home, right? And yes, screw them, they need to stay at home. But also there are some real genuine concerns, because when police power and state power begins affecting white folks, begins affecting well-off folks, it affects marginalized communities even more than that. And we see a local story that exemplifies exactly that. Just about an hour south of here in Albertville, the police department issued a memo to residents that it would begin rigorously enforcing a years-old ordinance against multifamily dwellings. Now, again, this ordinance is years old, but they were not previously proactively going and like checking and enforcing it. When an issue came up, they said that they would issue a citation, but now they're going to be going out proactively into the community and checking to see if a dwelling has multiple families in it, and issuing citations or legal consequences. And that's just absurd. It's criminalizing poverty. It's you know, it's unjustifiable. You know, I've seen these memes about that say if you were to if you snitched on somebody for violating a stay-at-home order, you would have snitched on Anne Frank or something. Yeah. And a lot of times that's a bit hyperbolic. But seriously, like, if you are calling the police on a family that is so poor that they can't afford separate dwellings for their separate families, and with the knowledge that the result is going to be they are put in jail or they are fined for $500 that they don't have, obviously, because there are 2 or 3 or 4 families living in the same house, no, you know, then you're a bad person, okay? Like, you are a bad person if you're calling the cops on a poor family that has to live with other families. And frankly, if you're a cop that's enforcing this order, like, you're a bad cop. You know, that's not okay. You can't just use the excuse, I'm just following orders. These have real consequences for real people. And you know, like, a just law or an unjust law is no law at all. And it really, really rankles me that they had the audacity to put this out there, that they had the audacity to create this ordinance in the first place. And it's clearly aimed at the Hispanic community in Albertville. The Hispanic community has been growing consistently over the years, and a lot of them are extremely poor. A lot of them are undocumented, and they don't have the money to live in single family units, and so they're living together. And
what's unfortunate is a lot of these families, a lot of the conservatives now that won't stand up for this type of policing effort were the same families that a generation or 2 generations ago were the exact same ones that was living in this abject poverty. You know, right. my parents come from multi-family dwellings, and you know, we're only a generation or 2 removed from the exact poverty levels that the Hispanics are living in, or not all of them, but some of the Hispanics are living in now. And it's really unfortunate that the generation now is not listening to their grandparents talk about the poverty that they went through.
It's really unfortunate. And we've seen videos, I don't know if you have, David, or any of the others listening to this, but I've seen videos of NYPD officers manhandling children and Black adults for not wearing masks on the subway in New York, instead of just providing masks. You know, like, how much cheaper would it be to just give the cops masks to hand out to people that are not wearing them than it is to pay dozens and dozens of cops to stand guard on the subway and arresting people for not wearing masks. It's absurd.
And risking people's health. I mean, you're risking the exact people that the police that are there supposedly to protect and serve, but the exact people that are there to protect and serve, you're risking their health by asking them, to come in closer contact with these people.
Right. You can't socially distance while you're arresting a person. Yeah. It's just not possible. And those two things, to me, really show what is deep in the DNA of America, the tendency towards punishment and retribution and away from solidarity and mutual aid. We can see it in the uniquely punitive response in the United States to the crime waves of the 80s and 90s. Instead of investing in education or anti-poverty programs or rehabilitation programs like so many other civilized Western countries did, we just threw people in prison. And it did not do anything for the crime rates. The crime rates decreased at the same rate as every other Western country. And we can see it now in the way that some of the stay-at-home orders and public health guidelines are being enforced. Yep. We have to resist the pull towards authoritarianism that is truly wrapped up in the DNA of America, and reach towards something else that I believe is really wrapped up in the DNA of America. That is the impulse towards justice, towards freedom, and towards solidarity. Like oppression, authoritarianism is really fundamental to America, but that's not all that America is. America also has deep traditions of liberation movements, of freedom movements, of solidarity between workers, and we have got to resist the pull towards the authoritarianism that's in our blood and move towards the liberation and the freedom and the solidarity that's in our blood. And obviously a lot of these people are just, they are not thinking clearly about the words police state and what it actually means. And a lot of their concerns are overblown. They do just want to get a haircut, or Karen does just want to get a manicure or a pedicure. But there are real concerns and there are real instances of police abuse of power in marginalized communities, in poor Black and brown communities, and towards poor white folks that we need to take a look at, and we need to make, and we need to fight against, because it's not good.
Yeah. And to touch on something that you said a while ago, as far as America being very authoritarian and the history and things like that. And I just, I'm going to disagree with you there a little bit. I think Americans are a whole lot more based on libertarianism and freedoms, and even though you wouldn't think it in the South right now, it's very, very, the history there is very anti-authoritarian, and the big pushback against big government, big business, corporations, federal banking, and things like that. We've got a long history of supporting those anti-authoritarian forces, but somewhere in the last 20 to 30 years, the conservative side of the political spectrum has convinced a lot of these anti-authoritarian people that that they're it's a good thing. It's they've twisted what we originally believed in and made it sound like, I'm having a difficult time expressing what I'm trying to say, but made it sound like the authoritarianism is good so long as it's authoritarianism that supports what I believe in,
right, and
not what is for the betterment of the society or the community as a whole.
Right. Yeah, and I don't disagree with that at all. I think, like I said, I do believe that a tendency towards authoritarianism and oppression and white supremacy and patriarchy really runs deep in the American tradition, and I do believe that that's true. But I also believe that there is a just as strong current of anti-authoritarian struggle, of freedom struggles, and anti-racist, anti-sexist, and pro-worker movements that run through America. And we have to run towards that and away from the former, because, freedom, justice, solidarity, that's where we want to go. And a lot of this that we're seeing is not that. Yeah.
Maybe if we play the national anthem during the stay-at-home orders, that the people will be less inclined to protest. Maybe. Since that's the whole big push, is we don't need to protest during the national anthem.
Maybe
we should have Kay Ivey play the national anthem.
Just play the national anthem on the tornado sirens.
Yes, exactly. That could
24/7.
That could fix the whole problem, or at the very minimum, show the overt racism that's in all of these protests.
Right. And speaking of the counter tendencies that I was talking about that run through that run through the American project. One of the things that is part of the authoritarian tendency is the division of the working class, and there is something that I've seen going on recently that just totally exemplifies that to me. So as an exposition, the CARES Act, it included $600 a week additional for unemployed folks for 4 months during this crisis. And that stimulus sunsets in 4 months. So that's $600 a week on top of whatever your state already gives you for unemployment. So here in Alabama, I think it tops out at $275 a week. So if you make, if you're going to be drawing that top out, then that's going to be $875 a week, before taxes, obviously. And unemployment, they do take taxes out of that. And there are folks that are still having to work, and I've seen folks, not completely without reason, really irritated that unemployed folks are now making more than they used to, and also more than essential workers are making now. And like I said, that's not totally without reason, but they are really angry at the people receiving this extra money, and that anger is just totally misplaced, because get a load of this. While they were getting mad at those folks who are making maybe a little bit, Sarah the bartender, let's say, who's making a little bit of extra money and now has enough money to buy a Nintendo Switch for the first time in her life, millionaires received a temporary tax cut that was buried within the CARES Act that will give folks earning over $1 million annually an average of a $1.7 million check. Yeah. The average millionaire is going to be getting a tax cut of $1.7 million, right? So while you're over here really angry at Sarah the bartender who now has a Nintendo Switch, this big corporate bigwig has $1.7 million more dollars. They spent more money on this tax break than all of the aid to hospitals combined. That's absurd. You are right to be angry that you're in the grocery store and you're not making as much as the people that are on unemployment right now. But the person to be mad at is the CEO of your company who is not giving you hazard pay. The person to be mad at is the politicians who are destroying unions and are not allowing you to organize for higher wages. Those are the people to be mad at. It's not Sarah the bartender. Okay, yeah. It's absurd.
Well,
So
and I
while
think,
you're,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
What I was going to say is, you're right. There's some justification there for people. They're frustrated on the one hand because they're having to work, and there's a lot of people that are not able to work, and they're drawing a little bit more money than what they used to. I get it, 100% get it. I don't think that, and I'll go to the defense, and maybe wrongly so, I'll go to the defense of a lot of the politicians that's laid this out. I believe it was laid out in good conscience that, there's going to be a lot of people that are in the $18, $20, $25 an hour range that's going to be laid off, and they were trying to bridge that gap that they would have lost. But what I don't think that a lot of the politicians anticipated was for the businesses to come out and declare so many essential workers. I think they really thought that, okay, a lot of these people are going to be laid off. They're not going to be essential. For example, the folks down at Lowe's. Are you telling me that Lowe's is an essential business? I mean, I recognize they're probably selling a few essential goods, some plumbing, some things that you may need to redo your house. But truly, what I've seen being purchased at Lowe's for the last 2 weeks is not essential. So the best thing that they could have done was said, for the essential workers, we're gonna provide hazard pay across the board, federal government, and then bring those rates up, because truly, a lot of these essential workers, so-called essential workers, especially the ones at the grocery stores, the ones at McDonald's, the ones at Burger King, it is truly sickening that they're still making the wages that they're making, and they may get, I've heard, one say that they were getting a $30 bonus a week. They were being provided literally, and I won't say the grocery store, but they were providing them with a soda, a free 20-ounce soda per day. And I'm thinking, God Almighty, is this the absolute best you can do?
Right.
So I get it. There's some justification to it.
Yeah.
But the justification is that I'm pissed because those people are at home drawing a few more dollars than I'm. The justification or what you should be angry about is the fact that you're still having to work and not making a penny more than you were, and your life's being put at risk.
Exactly. More often than not, when things like this happen, there is reason to be angry. There are lots of reasons to be angry, but the person to be angry at is not your neighbor to your left or to your right, or a person that is, lower than you socioeconomically. It's the person that's, the ruling class. Don't look left or right or down, look up. Look, that's where your problem is. And this is just one more iteration in a long line of keeping workers fighting over crumbs while the owner class makes off with the cake. We saw it with the advent of racial slavery. Before, there were, white indentured servants, and they were getting rowdy and wanting more, and so they started working with the black indentured servants, and so they were like, you know what, white folks, you're a little bit better off. These black folks are slaves. You white folks are a little bit better off, and we'll buy you off that way. We can see it with fear of immigrants. Eastern and Southern Europeans in the early 1900s, the Yellow Peril in the late 1800s, the Irish and the Hispanics today. It's all just ruling class tactics to keep workers fighting against each other, when really anytime you feel the urge to be angry with or look down on or fearful of your fellow workers, it's best to take a step back and look up, because your fellow worker is almost certainly not the architect of your misery, and your bickering will only serve as a distraction and a hindrance in creating a better world. It will not further the goal of creating a better world. Like being unnecessarily punitive towards immigrants will not create a better world. Getting mad at Sarah the bartender is not gonna create a better world. Okay.
And we talked about
the
this
ruling class. That's gonna point your anger where it needs to be, and point it together, and that'll make a better world.
Yeah, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago. We discussed that the stimulus packages has come out. We were getting some bumps in the unemployment. There was some good things going on. And what did I say? I said, we've got another one coming. We got another one coming down the pipe. Everybody knew that there was another one coming down the pipe. One just come out. I don't know if it's been signed yet. I don't think it's been signed yet. Trump has said he's going to sign it. What is the only thing that they've done? The only thing that they've done in this next stimulus package is fund the small business loan program.
Mm-hmm.
They've done absolutely nothing for workers. And I said, please get on the phone, send emails, talk to your legislators, talk to your congressmen. And the fact of the matter is, with the stimulus package that they had just released, it appeased a lot of people. They thought, yeah, we finally got something. There's no reason to call anybody. And here we are, less than 2 weeks later, and they're throwing tons of money at the small businesses. And don't get me wrong, the small business is important. I'm glad that they are providing some more loans to those people to keep their workers employed. The fact of the matter is, most of those workers are making slave wages, and those are the essential workers that they're forcing to stay on the books. But we could have done better, and we should have done better.
Yes, we could have, and we should have done better. And that small business protection program, that was a really good idea, in my opinion. And the Democrats had, in a previous version of that protection program that had more money, and it had more restrictions on what kind of companies could apply for it. So under the Democrats' plan, for example, Ruth's Chris couldn't have gotten that money, or what was the other one?
Shake Shack.
Shake Shack. They couldn't have gotten that money. It would have been really set aside for small businesses. And I read something that said like 80% of the loans that were given out from the Small Business Protection Program were to large publicly traded companies.
Yeah.
And,
because they were the ones with the funds and the capital to get into the banks quick.
Right.
The small businesses don't have the lawyers sitting there and the accountants sitting there when the loans opened up that morning, waiting in line.
Exactly. So, it's really important to, and this is what a lot of other countries are doing. They are essentially paying the payroll of companies to keep people employed so that they're not unemployed. So that way, when this is over, they can restart the economy more efficiently. They can just, flick a light and everybody goes back to work because they're still employed. Here, it's going to be a lot more difficult. The recovery is going to be a lot more difficult here than in most other countries, because what we are doing is laying workers off, and instead of paying them through their job. And so now when people go back into the workforce after this is over, they're going to be going into a workforce with 20% unemployment, where competition is a lot higher for jobs, where they don't have as much bargaining power because they could be more easily replaced with a pool of reserved labor. And so I'm really worried about the recovery that is going to result from the way that we have structured this, the shutdown. I'm really worried about that. They've
stacked the cards in favor of business once again. They've stacked the cards in favor of business once again. Perfect opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. That's what Milton Friedman. That's what he proposed. He was like, folks are not going to accept these unpopular free market ideas. when times are good. So you have to wait for a disaster. And as soon as there's a disaster, you got to make sure that your ideas are the ones lying around. And his ideas have been the ones that were lying around for a really long time. I've been reading a really good book by Naomi Klein called Shock Doctrine about that exactly, about how capitalists the world over have been taking advantage of disasters to rewrite laws, rewrite constitutions, overthrow governments, and institute unpopular free market reforms that are really bad for workers and for the working class, and really good for capitalists.
Yep.
So with that, we're through the current events section of what we're doing today. A couple weeks ago, we took last week off. Both of us have had a lot of stuff going, so we took last week off. But the week before that, we introduced a series about what a union is. Last time, we talked about what it is mechanically and structurally. We talked about different labor federations. We talked about the day-to-day business of a local union. Really good information in that. You can go back and watch that. Today, we're going to be talking about labor history. Like, why is a union? Why did unions form historically? Really good information. Next time, we're going to be talking about what makes a union work, the leverage that coming together as a union brings workers, and then we're going to be doing some union myth busting. The show after that. So again, today we're going to be talking about labor history, and just like last time, David is much more well-read on this kind of stuff than I am. He has been in the labor movement for decades. He's really old, so he knows his stuff. And so I'm gonna
punch in the gut to pass the mic over. What? I feel really old most of the time, especially when I'm on camera with you. So yeah.
So I'm gonna hand the lead over to David, and he's gonna be talking about some labor history.
Labor history. So
probably lived through most of it, right?
Yeah. I have lived through a little bit of it. It feels like it after a few times walking the picket line here. It brings back some. you can go back and. Talk about walking the picket line with my dad when Paul James sent the National Guard in to bust the picket line up. Wasn't that long ago, but it was right over there in Cortland, Alabama. There's a lot of folks fighting the National Guard, fighting the state troopers out there on that picket line for their labor rights. So yeah. Every time we have a strike, it brings up a lot of the past. But I guess we'll jump right in and really discuss why labor history is important, because you hear a lot of times the capitalists, the working, have convinced the working class people that we don't need unions anymore. I hear it. It's amazing how much I hear out of working class people, even like people living in poverty that I talk to on a daily basis that say, unions was real good. They served their purpose. They got rid of child labor. They instituted the 40-hour work week. They helped bring about the Civil Rights Act. They helped bring about the Social Security Administration. They provided so many great things for us, just average, everyday working people that are not going to be able to save the money for retirement. But they're not needed anymore. We really don't need labor unions anymore. They've outsourced all the work to China, to Mexico, to a lot of the Eastern Bloc. It's the same talking points, and what capital has done is convinced the working class that it is in their best interest not to be in a union. Yeah. To our own detriment. So it's important because what people realize and the gun rights advocates are very, very good at recognizing this. A lot of the civil rights advocates are very, very good at recognizing this. The same rights that we fought for from the beginning of time to own and bear arms, the right to vote without a voting tax, the right, all of these rights are constantly under attack. And just as the labor rights are constantly under attack, but they've convinced us somehow that we don't need unions anymore. Everything's great. There's no reason to push back anymore. And so, I just ask you, how many of y'all say, we don't need anybody pushing back on Second Amendment rights anymore? I hear that from conservatives on a consistent basis daily. And I 100% agree with you. Mm-hmm. Don't forget that those same rights that we have fought for over generations and generations in the U.S. are still under attack every day as well. So there's got to be somebody fighting for them.
Right. Anything good in your life has been fought for, and people have died for it, and people are going to have to fight to preserve it. These things, a 40-hour work week, the weekends, breaks, time off, retirement, all of that, none of that was given to workers. Yeah. They had to fight for it. And if we do not stay ready to fight for it and to fight for more, it'll be taken away.
Constantly. It's not just that it will be taken away. It is constantly being taken away. It's being taken away right now as we speak.
Right.
The Janus decision just a year and a half ago is a perfect example. There is a constant barrage of attacks against organized labor, and those attacks aren't just from the right. I'm just going to be completely honest. Those attacks are not just from the right. We have just as many people on the left attacking us as we do on the right. But what the right has successfully done is convince the working class that they're going to help them, and what the left has successfully done is convinced organized labor that they're going to help them. And both of us are being lied to from both sides. So we'll move on. I'll get off the diatribe there. We'll get into the history, and it starts really with the founding of America. Originally, there weren't a lot of unions around. What we seen was in the pre-Civil War years, before 1870, you had some what we would refer to nowadays as guilds. There were some organization of workers, but not a lot. You've seen the organizations were very loosely, very loosely organized. They would fight to satisfy their needs, whatever that may be. There was very short-term gains, because the fact of the matter is most of the people during those times were living hand to mouth. They were living day to day. They weren't really concerned long-term about retirement. They weren't concerned about health care, a lot of the things that we're concerned about today. They were struggling to put food on the table every day and to make it through the winter. So consequently, a lot of those organizations, they never really came to fruition to be a much benefit other than just daily help for the workers, which is a great thing. But as we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes, you've got to develop a long-term strategy.
Right.
So a lot of the workers that what we see like you were talking about earlier, as far as the police state and the authoritarianism. We brought in the immigrants from Europe. We brought in immigrants from Africa, made up a bulk of the workforce. So, you know, everyone knows about slavery. If you're from the South, you know about slavery. We know what we went through with that. What a lot of people don't recognize is the indentured servitude of the Irish, the indentured servitude of the Italians. A lot of the workers that they brought over were basically slaves, even though they didn't call them slaves. But the bulk of the workforce were indentured servants, slaves, and then, of course, all the white folks. Most of the white folks were free workers. The guilds, they able to organize in joint associations. The biggest thing with the guilds were they were, as they organized in the guilds were basically there. It was almost like a free market capitalism type thing. They were there to monopolize between each other and say, we're going to set the prices, we're going to set the minimum price, because you know, one horseshoe maker down the road may have been willing to make a horseshoe for a few cents less than the other one. And they were also there to structurally ensure the quality of their product. And it goes back to a lot of this pre-industrial revolution was, you've seen like the blacksmiths and people like that. They were working for themselves. There wasn't a big concern for unionism, because there, other than like the railroad industry, where we brought in a lot of the Asians and a lot of the Eastern Europeans to work on the railroad, or the agriculture industry, where you brought in a lot of the slaves to work in that industry. There really wasn't a lot of big business ownership back then. So we kind of come around to into the Civil War, the years between the late 1860s and World War I, where we've seen structural growth of three significantly different national labor organizations. The first one being the Knights of Labor, were formed shortly after everybody come home from the Civil War, around 1869. It was very much a business-like union, what a lot of people refer to as business unions today. They were, it was very well organized. It was a secret society. The reason that it was a secret society is because at the time, unions were outlawed. It was actually, they considered it an organized crime. So there was a lot of secret handshakes. A lot of the Knights of Labor were based loosely around other fraternal organizations like the Masons, Freemasons, and things like that. So the Knights of Labor, they were extremely well organized. The biggest thing was they were democratically elected as well, but they really had a top-down approach to where the workers were peasants, for lack of a better word, and they really couldn't. They looked at it as they couldn't make up their minds as to, they should not be able to make up their minds what was in their best interest. So you've seen the executive boards of the Knights of Labor putting a great deal of power on the workers, sometimes to break strikes, to prevent new strikes. But one of the big benefits of the Knights of Labor was their belief. They were anti-racial. In other words, in that time, there were a lot of your trade unions that would not accept black membership, and the Knights of Labor was very, very progressive at that time. So they accepted not only a minority labor, but they also recognized the social justice programs that they needed to start implementing. So they funded a lot of and if you go back, you see, like if you go back and look at old organized history photos, you'll see a lot of the Knights of Labor parades with the big banners, and they were real big into not just the labor portion of it, but they recognized the family portion of it and the time off, and so they done a lot of parades, they done a lot of picnics and things like that.
Yeah, you talked about the anti-racist and the kind of social justice type of stuff that they did. I thought that was really interesting because you also mentioned their kind of elitism, and that they felt like the people in power, the executive board, kind of felt like they knew better than the rank and file folks. And so it's really interesting but because generally you associate, today at least, you associate the deep democracy traditions with the social justice movements and the anti-racist movements, and you associate the elite intelligentsia you associate those traditions with the racist and more anti-social justice movements. And so that's interesting that they had that elite intelligentsia kind of mindset, but they also were pro social justice movements and anti-racist and stuff. I thought that was kind of an interesting note about them. Yep.
Yeah. And from my studies and from what I've learned, what I've been instructed, the early and what we're building on right here with the Knights of Labor, the AFL, the IWW, and later on the CIO, the early organizations were initially founded by one person, maybe two, and in the case of the IWW, a handful, but they founded those organizations based upon their belief system. So you see a wide variety of belief systems in different organizations. But yeah, and the one other thing that the Knights of Labor that I should probably mention is the Knights of Labor were very, I guess the word is anti-elitist in their organizing efforts. So what you saw was, like with the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, was organizing more around trades and crafts. The Knights of Labor did not care what trade, what craft you were. They were trying to organize industrially as well. So they were, to me, the Knights of Labor was kind of that gap. They bridged that gap between AFL and IWW. And we'll get into IWW in a minute, and you'll see what I'm talking about. You already know what I'm talking about. But so then the second one to come along was the American Federation of Labor. And the American Federation of Labor was basically, the entire founding was in opposition to the Knights of Labor. There was a great deal of discontent with the Knights due to their petty distinctions of organizational boundaries between crafts, and that's kind of what we were talking about just a second ago. They really, the AFL was they wanted to draw the lines between the crafts. They were very not mad. They were unhappy with the fact that the Knights of Labor would discourage some strikes, encourage others. And the biggest thing was the AFL didn't believe in the early days, did not believe in the social justice reforms that the Knights of Labor so much pushed. The AFL was very pure and simply, their entire premise was built around trade unionism. They really enjoyed having the trades and the crafts, even though they were all brought together under one organization. They've seen that an electrician, a boiler maker, what have you, at the time, they were more of an elitist association.
Mm-hmm.
They regarded the trades higher than the other people, and they weren't as much interested in the labor movement as a whole, like unions are nowadays. And then you've got the radical group founded by Big Bill Haywood, the IWW, or the Wobblies. And whenever I originally created this, there was so much that I wanted to put in, but that I thought it did a disjustice to the IWWs to speak on a lot of the things that they originally were developed around. So I just kind of kept it brief and said, you know, the original goals of the IWW, or the industrial workers of the world, was to unite all workers into one giant union, regardless of trade, regardless of craft, regardless of what you're doing. They thought that, you know, all the workers should be banded together. And for the biggest reason was the quick destruction of capitalism. They thought that that the worker should own the means of production. And it goes back hundreds of years, but that they were very opposed to the structural concept of the AFL, because the AFL didn't address a lot of the needs or wants of a large majority of the workforce in the primary industries in America. You know, we talked about the AFL being big on trades, and
Right.
there was a lot of workers out there that weren't tradespeople. They were just general laborers. I don't know the percentage, but it was very high. And if you weren't in one of these specific trades, then you pretty much got cast aside. They didn't care about you. And
even if you were in a specific trade, but you weren't a white male, the AFL wasn't interested in organizing you as well. And that was another thing, that the IWW was founded in opposition to the AFL. They were really big on incorporating people of color and women into their ranks and into their leadership, where the AFL was definitely opposed to.
White male. And there was a place for women, but it was a typical patriarchy.
Right.
There was some support, the early League of Women Voters and things like that, but there was never any support to actually get women's wages the same as a man's. That's for certain. Unlike in the IWW, and both of us are WAP, so we know a little bit of the history there. Needless to say, the IWW were a very radical group, and to their detriment and to their benefit, a lot of times they were called in to help out a lot of the striking workers when it was going to get violent. And so the IWW was really known for when the Pinkertons and people like that came around and started abusing the workers, then they knew that they could lean on the IWW to come in, and there was going to be a fight. And what you see is in a lot of the Wild West, what they call Wild West stories nowadays are glossed over. But the fact of the matter is, the IWW was founded out west, and they fought a lot of the big government and big business capitalist issues in the West early on.
Yeah.
Especially with miners, with the gold rush and things like that was out there. They were very instrumental in those strikes. So we get through that, We get into kind of the 1930s after the war, and you've got the Congress of Industrial Organizations, what now makes up the second half of the AFL-CIO. They were the CIO. They were a separate entity at the time. The Depression after the war brought about a lot of social changes to the fabric of American society. It was very visible in how America, and when I say America, we're talking about business and politicians in general, dealt with workers and people that needed, people in need. So at the time, you had all of the workers coming back from the war. Legislation was passed to allow workers the right to organize, which was tremendous because prior to that, you know, as I said earlier, it was considered a criminal activity to organize together and try to negotiate.
And if I could just go off on a riff on that for a little bit, you know, folks love to, especially folks who kind of deify the founders, they love to talk about freedom of speech and the First Amendment and all of that, freedom of association and how that was enshrined in our Constitution or whatever. And it's like the words were put in our Constitution, but the actual follow through did not happen until workers came together and put their bodies on the line against state and capitalist authority. Yep. To make it so that they follow through. You know, that it's such an important point that I just wanted to throw that in there, that, and it's basically just reiterating what we said at the beginning. Everything, including just the right to associate, which is supposedly in our Constitution, but everything up to and including just the right to associate as an organization of workers was fought for. People died for it. People were put in prison for it. People were executed for it. And, you know, we just need to remember that. And and we need to remember that it was not a liberal elite that gave us those freedoms and those rights and those, it wasn't that. It was mass movements of workers that came together to do that.
And if you go back, and there was a lot of stuff that I didn't include today because of time constraints. Nobody wants to sit here for 6 hours and listen to me drone on about labor history. But if you go back and look in the early founding, what you're talking about, there was a separation even amongst the founding fathers, with Thomas Jefferson leaning more towards a liberty side and more towards a freedom for workers, freedom for individual rights and things like that. And then you had what they call the Federalist side, which you've still got the Federalist Papers today, which is a extremely right-leaning website that believed that the majority of Americans were stupid peons and they deserve absolutely no say in how government works or how anything else works for that matter. And that's where you got your, originally your senators were not elected. If you go back and look at the history of America, they were specifically to represent the interests of business owners because they did not want democracy, pure and simple, because the majority of Americans were being screwed over. Right. And if they allowed democracy, then of course we would have it a little bit better than what they want. Right. So
yeah, we were talking about the CIO.
Yep, the CIO, and so the legislation was passed to give workers the right to organize and bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing under the guidelines of the Wagner Act, which we now refer to as the NLRA, or the National Labor Relations Act. Under the leadership of John L. Lewis, Philip Murray, Walter Reuther, and others, steps were taken to organize the masses of unskilled workers into the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. They drew from the successes of the AFL and structural organization. They differed, however, in one crucial aspect, that they organized workers along industrial lines without regard to the occupation. So they kind of picked up where the IWW kind of left off, even though you know, the IWW has always been around. They really seen a large drop off after the war. And one of the reasons that they seen that drop off was because of the anti-communist sentiment after the war.
Yeah, they had the general headquarters of the IWW was raided, and all of their documents were burned at one point. At another point in history, 100 American citizens who were members of the IWW were deported because they were members of the IWW. You know, lots of them were jailed. Lots of them were like blacklisted. You know, it was for, you know, the middle of the 20th century was a really, really dangerous time to be a left-wing radical in America. And the IWW has always been a left-wing radical union. So the, you know, the AFL and the CIO, the AFL-CIO kind of survived by throwing a lot of their socialist leaders under the bus, kicking them out, expelling them, putting in anti-communist pledges in all of their stuff. And, you know, the IWW wouldn't do that. And so they were targeted a lot more than a lot of the other unions were. And that's a big part of the decline, is that there, you know, there's actual literal state violence was used to suppress and oppress the IWW and their members.
Yeah, not just their members, all union members across the board, but for certain IWW. And the CIO was kind of built out of that same radicalism, because even if you go back today, for people that have been in the labor movement for 20 or 30 years, there's still a big, you know, kind of not really a running joke, but I guess it is kind of a running joke that, you know, the AFL-CIO today, the reason that it's so weak is because of the AFL. And the CIO was more of, even, they picked up a lot where the IWW left off. Right. And so there was a lot of communists early on in the CIO, up until they merged. And then, like you said, the government started really trying to crack down, because it's always been a bench and purge with the labor movement. Whenever they get too strong, the government steps in on behalf of capital and squashes a lot of the movement. So the CIO at that point became a loose organization of independent national unions. And then in 1954, the AFL and CIO merged, and this brought about the labor movement as we speak of in America, and really the one that we recognize today is the AFL-CIO, is the organization of all the national and international unions that have a presence in the United States. So that kind of briefly brings us to today with where we're at with the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. It was patterned after the Railway Labor Act of 1926, and then amended by the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947. It is the primary legislation that governs the legal status of all organized labor and collective bargaining processes. The NLRA, or the National Labor Relations Act, sets a national policy of the concept of collective bargaining process as a way to achieve industrial harmony. And without getting off too far, you know, this is kind of where I'll throw up my hate for union political combination. There is the fact that, you know, lot of the higher ups of the unions, and then a lot of the politicians are always trying to figure out a way to quell the labor movement. There's a constant bending of the knee to the labor movement to say what is the absolute least we can get them to make them go away. What will say, and really speaks to what happened the last couple of weeks with the CARES Act and the stimulus package, and let's give them a little bit of money and hope that they'll shut up for the time being.
Right.
So that the NLRA governs how we collectively bargain in the United States today. So long as we operate within the rules that are governed by the National Labor Relations Board, and it's probably worth mentioning now that the National Labor Relations Board is the board that is appointed by the current administration, whoever that may be, that oversees the National Labor Relations Act. So they make decisions based on their interpretation of the act. What we have seen, and without giving too big of a gut punch to the Trump supporters out there, what we have seen since Trump has been in office is the way the board, the way the National Relations Board is appointed. The president gets to appoint the board, but it is a board, I think, of 5. It's either 5 or 7, but there's always one extra, so there's no gridlock. We'll say 5. So the president gets to appoint 3 Republicans, but he also has to appoint 2 Democrats to serve on the board. If during Obama's tenure, the president appointed 3 Democrats to the board and had to appoint 2 Republicans to the board. So it gives a little bit of sway. The administration has a little bit of sway in how things are interpreted at that board. And that board determines everything to do with organized labor. All of the grievances that are pushed up to that level are determined by the National Labor Relations Board. All interpretations, any disagreements between labor and capital go to that board. Right now, do you know how many Democrats sit on the National Labor Relations Board?
I guess 2, right?
You would think so. But do you know how many actually sit on the board?
No, I can't say I do. How many?
0. 0.
How is that?
He has refused to appoint any opposition to the board. So you have 3 Republicans sitting on the board and 2 empty seats for the last 3 years, almost 4 years.
I didn't even know. That's insane.
And
that's crazy because you said something about how the president has a little bit of sway over that, and it's like he has total sway because you can pick. You can go down south and pick an old blue dog Democrat who hates organized labor appoint them to the board, presumably. Like it wouldn't be. Surely it wouldn't be that hard to just find some Democrat who agrees with you on labor issues and appoint them to the board. But he won't even do that. That's insane. That's wild. I had no idea.
And so, that kind of bears saying here is why you hate to have politics involved with organized labor. It's absolute. I hate it worse than anything in the world, but it's also that kind of speaks to the reason why it's so important to be intermingled with politics, because unfortunately everything we do in the United States is, the regulations, the laws are set through the legislative process. So most people don't recognize that all of the pro-Trump, pro-American worker sentiment that he likes to speak. Whenever you tell them that, they shut up real quick because they recognize that that's probably one of the worst things that you can do to organize labor is not appoint the two dissenting opinions. Even though you know as well as I do, if you got two dissenting opinions, it's just like the Supreme Court. You're not going to get anything through. But at least you have a voice of reason there, and they've absolutely refused to even provide the dissenting voice of reason.
Well, and that's like the I think that liberals especially, I don't think leftists really have this illusion as much, but like liberals have got to kind of demystify government institutions like the National Labor Relations Board or like the Supreme Court, because all they are is another field on which to contest and exercise power.
Yep, it's a battleground.
It's a battleground. It is not, I don't care what the constitutionalists or the originalists say they're doing. They're molding the words on the paper to whatever their ideological biases say that it should say. No one interprets the law neutrally. That's not something that happens. And so, they need to, like, John Roberts and a lot of Democrats say things like, oh, there are no Republican judges on the Supreme Court and there are no Democratic judges on the Supreme Court. And that's just a bunch of BS. That is a load of garbage, and you've got to get that out of your mind. Demystify these institutions. They're not special. They're not lofty. These are not the 9 most intelligent, most qualified people in America. They are 9 people that were appointed by other people to contest and exercise power for their constituents. And we need to decide who their constituents are going to be, and it should be us. We should make sure that the people that are on the Supreme Court are representing the interests of working people and not the owner class, the ruling class. And, that's, I just, when you talked about that, that made me think of the way that the Supreme Court and all and these government institutions are kind of mystified, and it just really upsets me because it's so blatantly political. Need to wake up.
Yeah, and we talked about it on the last meeting, and I'll just bring it up here again because it's worth saying that although we recognize that Democrats has been more in favor of organized labor than the Republicans, nobody's really helped us throughout history, with the exception of 1 or 2. So, yeah, it is a political effort, but the fact of the matter is boots on the ground matters more than any politician in office will ever matter. But I say that with the caveat that politicians in office have everything to do with our liberties that we appreciate today, or that we may not appreciate today.
And boots on the ground to influence politicians too.
Well, you'd like to think so, but and they have to some extent, but unfortunately it takes a large majority of boots on the ground to influence politicians. It takes a whole lot less boots on the ground to influence capital, because capital reacts a whole lot quicker than politicians do. So we talked a little bit about the repression of unions early on, and we're going to kind of back up just a hair bit and talk about the conspiracy doctrine, which was originally where shortly after the Founding Fathers penned our Bill of Rights, they turned the courts turned around and declared it illegal in 1806 in the Cordwainers case to have a union. So basically, about 30 years after we were conceived as a nation, they determined that a strike for higher wages constituted a criminal conspiracy. So when workers band together and said we're no longer going to take this crap, the court said that an individual employee acting on his own may refuse to work, but an agreement between two or more workers to refuse to work constituted an unlawful criminal conspiracy. So we can draw some important implications for the present time, but at the time of the case, there were some very interesting changes to the workplace and the product market. The footwear industry was the first to feel the Industrial Revolution. Shoes and boots were often made by master workers in small shops who sold the goods to the general public in their communities. However, it soon became possible for workers to produce goods in Philadelphia and sell in other states where there was not any real production of products. So as this occurred, the wage rates for the workers began to drop because the less skilled workers were employed to do sub-assembly operations of boot manufacturing. So, you know, capital, just like they do today, capital figured out, let's see how we can get these low-skilled operations prior to the master boot maker and source them out to the cheapest labor that we can possibly find. So when the more skilled laborers attempted to object, they were met with resistance from the owners and the new less skilled workers, because once again, as always, capital does pit workers against workers. The highly skilled workers elected to produce only finer shoes and left the production of the lesser quality shoes up to the owners and the less skilled workers. This allowed the owners of the new production facilities to further reduce rates. The workers responded by allowing for reduced pay for shoes to be exported at a higher rate for the local market. And then soon the workers became dependent on the export trade, and there was no turning back. So when all the workers got together to try to do something about the pay rates, some of them decided to strike. The strike vote was close. And they say 64 strike, 50 against. During this time, there was this is kind of something we talked about earlier, there was a great political debate between Thomas Jefferson and those that followed him, called the Jeffersonians. And then the Federalists, John Adams and his followers. And the Jeffersonians felt that the workers should share in the democratic process by allowing all of them to join together and give them the maximum of their individual freedoms. And the Federalists were indifferent to the welfare of the workers. They felt that the workers were incompetent to do the wise thing and thus incapable of doing the right thing for their own good, which kind of speaks to a lot of what we deal with today. And then they felt that only the rich and powerful had the right to make those decisions. And of course, the Federals served the interests of the aristocrats. So as the week strike is in week, not week long, but as in week, as in is a very weak
not strong.
note. Yep. 8 of the leaders were arrested and jailed. And then, of course, this frightened the rest of the strikers and kind of dissipated after that. The leaders were taken to trial before judges of that time who were predominantly Federalists, of course. They ruled that the strikers were involved in trying to take the property rights of the employers by raising their wages. Thus, that was considered criminal activity. And since the workers were a member of an association of workers, they also considered that a conspiracy. I know you got something to say, so come on with it.
Yeah. Well, you know, that's the I think the fact that it's a weak strike, it was a weak strike, a not strong strike, is really important. Jane McAlevey is a prominent labor organizer and lecturer, teacher on union issues, and she's always harping about the necessity of acquiring a supermajority for a strike. Yes. Otherwise, it's not going to be, it's not going to be powerful. It's not going to work as well. And I can't help but wonder, this looks like kind of one of the first strikes. And I can't help but wonder if those 60 had done the work of convincing and organizing and inoculating those other 50, and they had all went on strike together. I can't help but wonder, how the course of history might change.
Yep.
Because if all of the workers had gone on strike, then the capitalists would have been more motivated to increase their wages and wouldn't have had time to take them to court and all that, because they would have needed to have been taking in profits. And if other workers had seen success of that all-out strike, they might, it's a shame, the missed opportunity there by such a weak strike. Yep. There at kind of the beginning of labor history.
And it really speaks to unions as a whole today. Business does this very well for the most part. Most businesses do this very well. When things fail, or when things, when they have a project that don't come to fruition, or they have a project that goes great, after the fact, they love to meet and talk about what do we do right and what do we do wrong. And this is where I really, as a young unionist, it got all over me, and I hated it, because every time something happened, I wanted to go on strike. And then the more that I've learned about labor history, and I think this speaks to why you need to do labor history. But as I grew in the labor movement and began negotiating contracts and began learning also about the labor history, one of the things that we do as machinists is we take a vote pre-negotiation, and we say how many people are willing to go on strike. And generally speaking, it's around 98, 99%. Because before the contract is negotiated, everybody's willing to go on strike if they don't get what they want.
Right.
Once they see the contract nowadays, businesses have very good statisticians and analysts, and they can cater to different subsections, whether it be the younger vote, whether it be the older vote, whether it be, a skilled, a skilled portion of the bargaining unit against fork truck drivers. And they calculate those numbers, and they can generally offer enough to buy an acceptance. But, bringing it back to the point was, one thing that the machinists always do is we have two votes, and it never fails. After every contract I negotiate, probably 90% of the membership, number one, don't understand why we have two votes, but number two are just absolutely furious that we have two votes, because we have the first vote is, do we accept or do we reject the contract? And all you have to do is have a 50% plus one member accept the contract, and then we don't have the second vote. We go back to work. If 50% plus one member votes to reject the contract, then we go to a second vote, and that vote is the strike vote. And in order to go on strike, we have to have 66% plus one member. And so I guess that's something that a lot of the labor unions have learned over the time is you don't want just a simple majority. to walk out, because a simple majority means the very, very limited minority is going to kill you going back into work.
Right.
But
Exactly.
yeah, so, and that for years that just drove me up the wall. But then you start doing a little bit of labor history and you recognize sometimes you need to choose your battles that you're going to fight. And them not choosing this one really set us back 40 years basically.
Yeah.
So then we get into the 1840s to 1890s, which is kind of the toleration, where capital and the government said, we recognize that unions need to exist, and they tolerated us, but they really didn't give us a whole lot of rights. They abandoned the criminal conspiracy doctrine, where the cordwainers had lost. And the pivotal case was the shoemaking industry and the Boston Journeyman Shoemaker Society. And in 1842, the Commonwealth versus Hunt, the court said that joining a union was not an illegal act. In this case, 7 members of the Boston Journeyman Bootmaker Society were tried and convicted in a lower court because we were still following the Cordwainers Act for conspiracy to join the organization. That, among other things, sought to damage employers and other workers who did not join the union. The higher court rejected the decision of the lower court. They held that only when the association of individuals committed a specific illegal act would the courts entertain the question of conspiracy. So basically they said, so long as they didn't go on strike,
Yeah.
then they hadn't committed an illegal act. So it was, they won a little bit back, but
Right.
not a lot. So at the time, the labor organizations were fighting hard to demand the start of public education for all children. A lot of the workers understood that education was a key to improve the quality of life for their children and for society in general. So in short, the political environment had changed from the distrust of common people to the desire to seek a greater input into society. And it kind of started aligning with more of the Jeffersonian principles or the way of thinking. But it also speaks to the fact that, the courts are once again deciding the fate of the working class people. So we move on into 1890s to the 1930s. This was moving up to the World War, where while the courts recognized that unions, that it wasn't against the law, Freedom Association wasn't against the law. What they were doing now was they were providing injunctions. So injunctions began to come on the scene of labor relations after several reversal of the criminal conspiracy doctrines. The injunction is defined as an order by a court to stop actions of one party against another party, which could result in damage to the party seeking the injunction. So basically, like I said a while ago, they said, yeah, you can join any association you want, but you can't band together and do anything about it.
Right.
So if there was a strike call, then the business would go to the court, and the court would provide an injunction. And it still happens today. When we went to, I guess we'll divert here and say, when we went to Spring Hill, Tennessee last year, what was the one thing that had happened right before we went up there was all the strikers was out there walking the picket line and blocking traffic. And right before the weekend, on a Saturday, they got a judge in Tennessee to provide an injunction that said anybody that blocked traffic, I can't remember the fine, but it was like $50,000.
I thought it was 25 or 50,000.
25 or 50. Yeah, it was crazy.
A lot. Yeah.
So it kind of speaks to this is in the 1800s, and 200 years later, we're still having to deal with the same crap.
Yeah.
So the powerful employers were able to get their friendly courts seek injunctions against workers. The employers would argue that the workers were attempting to rob his property rights, and it's just goes on and goes on, but nobody ever speaks about the employers robbing the property rights of the workers and the labor that they're providing. So the injunctions were issued under different terms, but at the end of the day, it basically went back to the businesses being in bed with the courts, and the courts blocking workers' action. The employers were able to turn the federal laws, which had been written to control the employers, against the workers. The antitrust legislation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act allowed the employers to force the federal government to issue injunctions. At the same time, the employers could demand the use of federal power to control unions. So during that same time period, unions found that employers would force them and their fellow workers to sign an agreement where they wouldn't join the union, or what they call a yellow dog contract. So we move into 1932 to 35. The 1930s brought about a period of reform due to the excessive abuses of big business with their injunctions and things like that. And the first major legislation was the Norris-Laguardia Act of 1932. And this new law attempted to right many of the abuses that the employers and the courts had instituted, basically saying you couldn't force your employers to sign a contract saying that they wouldn't join a union. It somewhat limited the use of injunctions, and it somewhat set standards for the conduct of judges. This allowed the workers to organize without fear. However, employers are forced to resort to greater violence because they lost the use of the courts to do their dirty work.
Right. The LaGuardia, one of the namesakes for the Norris-LaGuardia Act, it's just an interesting historical footnote. He was openly socialist and elected on a Republican ticket in New York.
Yeah.
So, it's just that's something that's interesting, and it's worth noting when people, like Dinesh D'Souza or, somebody else talks about the Democrats were the ones who were the party of Jim Crow or the party of the KKK or the party of, whatever.
Yeah.
That's just one more example of how radically different the parties used to be, that there were open socialists that were elected on the Republican line, in the 30s, so I thought that was interesting when I read that.
It speaks to, a lot of the things that you see, a lot of the right-wing media talk about is the Republicans being the party of Lincoln. It speaks to that same type mentality, and they were the party of Lincoln, but they've lost that claim long ago.
For sure.
Not that the Democrats are a whole lot better, but they have certainly, Republicans have certainly could care less about civil rights and the rights of individuals. So
yeah, you said that they started resorting to greater violence because they lost kind of the state framework to force workers to go back to work, and
unfortunately that's where you see a lot of the worker deaths come in. In the 1930s, when you see the Pinkertons being hired to come in and break strikes. I mean, basically once the employers lost the strong arm of the federal government and the courts, they resorted to flat out violence. And that's where you see like the Haymarket Affair and the Pullman strike and all of these strikes that are very well known in the organized labor, mostly because they resulted in our deaths, the deaths
Right.
of our forefathers.
Mm-hmm.
So at the same time, you had revolutions going on throughout the world, both political and social, that caused a great concern. I mean, you can go back and look at the Spanish Revolution in Spain, where the anarchists were going to overthrow the government. There was a lot of social upheaval that were centered around workers' rights. And when we say workers' rights, it's basically all of our rights, civil rights, because 90% of us are workers. So the revolutions, both political and social, caused great concern, and then the American corporations began financing the early movements of Nazism and fascism, which are the political movements of the right-wing alliances of big business and law and order nationalism, which, you know, for what it's worth, is what we see today. And a lot of people like to, a lot of the people on the right don't want to accept the fact that while they want to talk about their individual liberties as far as gun ownership goes, they don't want to recognize the individual liberties that we are losing by allowing the federal government to continue this form of oppression against workers' rights. So, yeah, big business laid the groundwork. From 1935 to 47, we have political revolution occurred in the United States. This change in America was brought about through the peaceful use of democracy, a change that allowed workers the right to organize under the genesis of present laws. The national policy of the right to organize was set to encourage the use of collective bargaining as a way to reach industrial harmony. However, employers started a campaign of propaganda which would not stop to the present day. So, kind of a caveat to say that once again, they're just, it's been an appeasement.
Yeah, during towards the end of that period is when some of the Red Scare stuff started happening, and you know, the destruction of the labor movement, like the seeds were kind of planted during this time of relative harmony.
Yeah, well, yeah, unfortunately, I guess that's when the seeds are always planted, is when you know, when everything's going good is when the other side is always plotting to figure out a way to get the upper hand. So it speaks to why we've always got to continue to be on guard. The political propaganda of the war years against unions, a slight increase in the number of strikes after the World War, and a political change brought about the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. So basically, you know, here again, we got it where it's a little bit fair, and they put several restrictions on organized labor, and it just goes back to big business is never satisfied.
One of the biggest things that was outlawed in the Taft-Hartley Act, if I'm remembering correctly, was the solidarity strike, where workers in the same kind of line of production cannot go on strike to support another set of workers who are on strike. And that was a really powerful tool that, or maybe it's called the secondary strike, or I
solidarity strike is basically the same thing.
Yeah, and that was a really powerful tool that workers had in their belt. So let's say, you know, we can talk about shoemakers again. Let's say the folks maybe in the shoe store, let's say, you know, somebody at Payless Shoes, the workers there the cashiers and the janitors and stuff at the storefront, they go on strike for better wages. In the past, oftentimes the workers in the manufacturing plant of like the sole of the shoe, they're making the rubber for the sole of the shoe, they would go on strike to support the workers and pay less. And the workers who were manufacturing and curing the leather, they would go on strike to support the workers at pay less. And that pressure on the different points of production would put more pressure on the people that own this shoe company, you know, because the manufacturers would be like, hey, you know, look, you know, Mr. Payless CEO, like our workers are striking now too, and if you don't fix something, then we're going to have to do business with somebody else because we can't have our work, you know, you got to treat your workers right. And that was a really powerful tool that unions and workers had in the tool belt that the capitalist class just couldn't abide by. And they said, no, you can't go on strike for other workers' rights. You know, totally, just totally violating, in my opinion, you know, freedom of speech and freedom of association again. And that law still stands today. Like today, you know, if workers at Payless were striking and the workers at a rubber sole manufacturing plant went on strike to support them or vice versa, then the secondary strike, the solidarity strike, those workers would be, an injunction would be leveled against them, and they would either be made to go back to work or they would be fined or put in jail.
Yeah, I mean, they'll tell them either you go back to work or you'll lose your job. But the fact of the matter is what they've done now in today's environment, because the finances are so, unionism is such a financially intensive business because of the amount of money that you have to pour in to represent workers at the state and federal levels. What they'll do is say, okay, you look at the amount of revenue that this employer lost, and they will fine the union that amount plus the fines that are enacted by the court. So yeah, basically they'll put any union out of business that refuses to go back to work, or not just refuses to go back to work, but that chooses to do a solidarity strike with other workers.
Right.
So yeah, it's brutal. It is brutal what they do as far as financial wise go.
And you know, these folks that are out there ostensibly claiming to be free speech warriors that want to make sure that Nazis have the right to speak on college campuses, you know, like where are they when workers are being fired for speaking out against injustices on the job? They're nowhere to be found because they are just weaponizing the ideals of free speech to push their political goals. They don't care about free speech. No. They don't care about you know, about a discourse. They don't care about ideas or anything like that. They have an agenda, and they're using these values that are, you know, that are widely held closely to the American public, and they're using that to push far right authoritarian ideas. They don't care about free speech. They don't care about workers. They don't care about justice or anything like that. They have a agenda that supports capitalists and the ruling class, and they are just hiding all of that behind, you know, free speech fights, and it's not real. Don't fall for it.
Yeah, it really says a lot, and I don't want to delve off too deep into that, but quickly, it really says a lot about someone's personal integrity and their personal beliefs when they say, and I'm just going to pull one out there, that somebody very racist, maybe anti-Semite, what have you, they go out and support that person to speak at in San Francisco on a college campus, and they say, I don't believe in what this person is saying, but I believe they should have the right to say it. But yet they don't do the same thing for workers. That really speaks to someone's moral fortitude.
Right.
And it makes you question, do you really not believe in what they're saying? Or do you really believe in what they're saying? You just don't want to admit it.
Right. And that's exactly right. And, I'm not saying, and I don't think you're saying that it is necessarily wrong to say, free speech for Nazis. I think that I'm probably broadly, free speech for everybody. Noam Chomsky has signed letters of support for the free speech rights of racist and authoritarian people in the past, but he's just consistently pro free speech. That is legitimately a value.
He don't choose which one he wants to support.
Exactly. That is legitimately a value that he holds dear, and that is very important in a lot of deeply democratic socialist traditions, the value of free speech. And so, if there's actually a person out there that is that has bigoted opinions, we don't think they should be thrown in jail necessarily for having bigoted opinions, and we're not scared to say that publicly, but we are also not scared to say publicly that workers should also have freedom of speech to talk about injustices in the workplace. And I'm much more interested in that, actually. I'm not going out and trying to find Nazis that are having troubles getting a platform. And it just amazes me that there are people that fall for that ruse, that think that all these people that are constantly, I got to make sure this racist guy has a platform to talk about his racism, and they just so happen to only ever find instances of freedom of speech being violated by right-wingers or racists or Nazis. It just so happens that in the United States of America, where the ruling class is, largely white and male and hates working people, it just so happens that the only people that are ever having their free speech repressed are Nazis.
And
it's unbelievable.
And it goes back to what we talked about earlier on. And the same people that will come out and say, I don't believe in what they're doing, but I believe in their right to do it, are the same people that will say you should be firing the pro football player because he knelt at during and if you just can't have it both ways. Free speech is free speech.
That's right.
And shouldn't be any discrimination against it.
Yeah. So you've got one last section here. Great strikes in the history of the U.S. Now, is this taken from a history of the United States in 10 strikes?
It is. It is, with the exception, and that's kind of, I added the last one, and now that we've went on for 2 hours at least, I'm cutting this short and gonna say we're gonna jump to the last one, because I think the last one that wasn't in the original 10, but the original 10, while I recognize the historical value of them, does not affect me as much as the 11th one did. The 11th one that I put in myself, and because I remember this one. I remember this one just as plain as day. And so we'll just talk quickly about the Patco strike. And for most people, I would say under 40 years of age, they probably don't even know what Patco is. They've never heard of Patco before, but the Patco was the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, which was a union that in the early 80s was, they represented all of the air traffic controllers in the entire nation. And so in the very early late 70s, early 80s, most of the unions were strongly opposed to Ronald Reagan. Although Reagan was and is still to today the only union leader to ever become president. Patco supported him and endorsed him, and I think they hung all of their political leverage on that endorsement. And this is just an assumption. I don't know. I've not read enough on the history to know for a fact, and I don't know that anybody would ever honestly say what their thoughts was when they went on strike. But it's very funny that they were the only ones to endorse him. And then on August 3rd, 1981, they were in negotiations with, and because they were considered civil workers, they were negotiating with the government. They rejected the government's pay raise offer, and 16,000 members went on strike to shut down the nation's commercial airlines, which, I mean, disabled all the airlines across the United States. And what I did not realize until I started doing a little bit of research on this topic was they were pushing for the 32-hour work week. I had no clue. I mean, that's pretty cool. But they wanted a reduction in the work week from 40 to 32 hours. They wanted a $10,000 bonus, pay raises up to 40%, and early retirement. And today, this 30, 40 years later, that I'm looking at that going, yeah, I would give my pinky finger for that contract today. And in 1981, I can't even imagine demanding that. So you got to wonder if their endorsement wasn't a setup where Reagan called their bluff. But at the time and still to today, federal employees can't strike. So they were barred from striking, and they went out on strike anyways. So the Transportation Department, under the direction of Ronald Reagan, implemented a backup plan for supervisors and air traffic controllers in the military to keep the system running. And the strikers were given 2 days to return to work, or they would be fired and banned from ever working in the federal capacity again, which was quite a discipline, because most of them were, lifelong federal workers. And so a fourth of the strikers come back to work, which really speaks to the solidarity of that union, that only 25% of 13,000, of the original 16,000 come back to work, and 13,000 said, we ain't doing it. I mean, even it's really almost hard to believe that just 40 years ago, 13,000 people were still saying, I'll lose my job. I'm not going to break a strike. So the strike collapsed. Yeah. Patco vanished, and basically what most modern day labor historians will tell us is that was the death knell in organized labor as we know it. What most of them won't tell you, and it's something that I've discussed with you in the past, is that plan what that was implemented was actually Jimmy Carter's plan that was put in place months before Ronald Reagan took office. So while all of the organized labor likes to blame Reagan and the Republicans for breaking the organized labor as we know it today, the fact of the matter was the Carter administration and these weak-ass Democrats in the South that I absolutely abhor were the ones that broke organized labor back as we know it, in our generation. So yeah, that's and it pretty much speaks to all the Democrats that we have pretty much in the South. They're not really Democrats as we know. They're more moderate or the left-leaning Republicans. They could care less. The 90, I hate to put a number on it, but it's well above 90% could care less about organized labor, including our own Doug Jones, which I plan on slamming while we have a little bit of.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to it. But yeah, that's definitely, you know, I've read about the Patco strike. That's, you know, that's a really depressing kind of turning point for the labor movement that, you know, it hasn't really recovered from to this day. You know, in the past half a decade or more, the labor movement has been seeing a revival with the teacher strikes.
Which are also illegal, you might add.
Which are, yeah,
They're
which are
just as illegal as a Patco strike was.
Right. And, you know, that just kind of, and the reason that the teacher strikes have been successful is that there was no backup plan. Yeah. They had organized the rest of the employees. So, you know, some interesting history from the West Virginia teacher strike specifically was that there was a teacher strike in West Virginia only 10 or 20 years earlier, but only the teachers went on strike. The janitors, the administrators, the counselors, everybody else stayed on, kept the schools running, the children still came to school, bus drivers still worked. But the last time in 2018, I think it was, when West Virginia educators went on strike, they went on strike with the bus drivers, with the janitors, with the administrators, and
really that is the solidarity.
Right, and that is what got the Republican legislature and the Republican governor to cave and back their demand and cave into their demands and give them what they wanted. So, you know, just to leave that, just to leave on a positive note, not all illegal strikes end in, you know, destruction for the entirety of the labor movement. Oftentimes, illegal strikes can be the beginning of good things for the labor movement. So,
yeah, if they're well planned,
you know, even if they're well planned, exactly. That goes back to what we were talking about, you know, earlier, the importance of solidarity and supermajority strikes and planning, going over lessons learned, stuff like that, not doing things willy-nilly, not just going on strike for any old reason without a plan. You know, it's important to do lots of planning. But even still, with all the stuff that has been going on lately, the labor movement is still not nearly as strong as it was before the Patco strike. We're still trying to build up.
But we're working on it.
We're working on it. All right. So David, that's, I don't have anything else, brother.
Yeah, me either. I think it's been time consuming. Hopefully somebody learned a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's some real good information in there. I think you did a really good job researching that. I appreciate it. And I will see you next week.
Yes. Have a good week, Jacob. Have a good week, everyone. Organize your workplace.
There you go.